Moving on to Malaysia now, the Southeast Asian country held general elections last week. It was the largest voter turnout in the nation's history. Malaysia's opposition coalition, People's Alliance, was defeated by the National Front, which has been in power for more than 50 years. But did the National Front cheat to win? Earlier this week, more than 40,000 people packed a stadium on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur to protest the results of the election. The opposition supporters wore black to symbolize a dark day for democracy. They waved signs that read "Democracy is dead" and shouted for reforms and clean elections. The opposition leader, Anwar Ibrahim, accused the National Front of rigging the election. He says that indelible ink meant to prevent multiple voting could be easily erased. And there are even charges that the government flew in tens of thousands of dubious voters to cast ballots in key districts. Prime Minister Razak has denied allegations that his ruling coalition played any part in fraudulent elections. To explain now what happened in the Malaysian elections and whether the opposition was cheated, we have Sudhir Thomas Vadaketh, a journalist and author living in neighboring Singapore. He was in Malaysia on election day and joins us on Skype. Welcome back to LinkAsia, Sudhir.
Thank you.
Well, the last time we talked, you predicted a 1 in 4 chance the opposition coalition, the People's Alliance, would win. It didn't. So what do you think happened?
Well, actually, the opposition performed quite well. They won more than 51% of the popular vote. That didn't translate into the sufficient number of parliamentary seats. So they didn't win the federal government, but they actually performed quite well in terms of the vote. I think they performed particularly well amongst Chinese voters, also amongst a lot of the urban Malay and Indian voters. Where they didn't do so well is perhaps in the rural areas, as well as in East Malaysia. The two big states of Sabah and Sarawak contribute more than a fourth of parliamentary seats. They didn't do very well over there.
So obviously they did make some inroads, but the opposition is still very unhappy, claiming electoral fraud. Among other things, it complains about winning the popular vote, but really getting only 89 out of 222 seats. What do you think of their charges? Was there fraud?
Well, the opposition says that some 30 seats actually have irregularities, and if that were true, that would actually overturn the results in their favor. But it's difficult to say right now with more information now. Some of the electoral irregularities that we heard of on that day as well when I was in Malaysia, things like phantom voters, irregular rolls, they were using an indelible ink to mark voters, which didn't really work very well. There were also power blackouts, the lights suddenly going off, and when the lights came back on at counting stations, suddenly there was an extra box of votes for the ruling coalition. So there are a lot of accusations of electoral fraud on that day, but it's very difficult to say which ones are true and which ones are not. I think the real problem that analysts are looking at is not something on election day itself, but it's actually a longer-term issue of gerrymandering, and I think the real issue that the government needs to address going forward is the constant sort of redrawing of electoral lines in Malaysia. That actually is a big hindrance to the opposition.
And you sort of alluded to this earlier. The election seemed to show the country is split along ethnic lines between rural and urban populations, between regions. The rally earlier this week showed there's a lot of disenchantment. What's your assessment of the National Front's ability to govern in such a divided country?
I think there's a lot of talk about the ethnic divide, and the Chinese certainly voted more for the opposition, but I think it's worth saying that there were a lot of Malays and Indians as well who voted for the opposition. So I don't think the ethnic divide is that stark, but there is certainly a rural-urban divide in the country. You clearly saw the urban voters moving towards the opposition in much greater numbers than the rural voters. Now this urban-rural divide, it's always been in Malaysia to some extent. It's not as big a divide as you might find in some other Asian countries. So I think actually the ruling coalition it has always faced this challenge of balancing the needs of urban and rural voters, and it will continue to do so. I think what's important for the ruling coalition and the Prime Minister Najib is to really rebuild trust amongst the urban population in Malaysia. And this includes things like clamping down on racism, clamping down on some of the extremist elements in Malaysia, and improving the electoral processes.
Well, obviously a lot of work that still needs to be done. Thank you, Sudhir.
Thank you.
Sudhir Thomas Vadaketh is author of Floating on a Malayan Breeze, Travels in Malaysia and Singapore. He also writes on Southeast Asia affairs. You can learn more about him on our experts page.
Now on U.S. airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories. World news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.